The bench at Dustmere Station had worn smooth from countless travelers, but none had sat there as long as Eleanor Bennett. 3 days, 72 hours of watching the horizon swallow trains that never brought the man who'd promised to marry her. Her fingers traced the letter's edges until the paper softened like old silk, the ink beginning to blur where her tears had fallen. "My dearest Eleanor," the letter began, in handwriting that had seemed so confident, so sure. "By the time you read this again, you'll be Mrs. James Miller, mistress of the finest cattle ranch in all of Wyoming Territory." Except James Miller didn't exist. The telegraph operator had confirmed it that morning, his weathered face creasing with the kind of pity reserved for fools and abandoned dogs. No Miller Ranch, no James Miller registered anywhere in the territory. Just another marriage swindle, another Eastern woman lured west with promises as empty as the prairie wind. Eleanor's silver hairbrush, her mother's final gift before consumption, claimed her at 15, weighed heavily in her pocket. It was the only possession she'd refused to sell when her father's debts came due after his heart gave out 2 years later. "A woman who can't afford to keep herself looking civilized," her mother had warned, "is a woman people stop seeing altogether." She pulled her coat tighter against the cold. November in Wyoming bit deeper than any Boston winter she'd known, as if the very air determined to remind her how far from home she'd strayed. "Miss?" Station Master Fletcher approached with careful steps, his boots scraped against the platform's warped boards. "Miss Bennett, isn't it? The westbound's coming through in an hour. I could arrange passage back east. The railroad company sometimes makes allowances for situations." Eleanor's spine straightened, though the effort cost her. 24, and she'd already been marked as one of those women, the ones who'd gambled everything on a letter and lost. Back in Boston, they'd shake their heads. "Poor Eleanor Bennett," they'd whisper, "always did have more dreams than sense." "I'm not going back," she said, surprised by her own steadiness. Fletcher shifted his weight, his shadow falling across her dusty traveling dress. "Miss, you can't just sit here forever. This ain't no place for a woman alone. Dustmere's rough territory. We got cowboys, miners, all sorts passing through." "I said, I'm not going back." She stood, her legs protesting after hours of stillness. The platform seemed to tilt. Or maybe that was hunger making the world unsteady. Her last piece of bread had been breakfast yesterday. Pride, it turned out, was difficult to digest. Fletcher pulled something from his vest pocket, a silver dollar. "For food, miss. There's a boarding house 2 streets over. Mrs. Holloway runs a clean establishment." The coin glinted in the afternoon sun like a small accusation. Charity. She'd come west to escape exactly this, the suffocating pity of being Eleanor Bennett, the school teacher whose parents died leaving her with elegant handwriting, a thorough education, and absolutely nothing else. "I have money," she lied, her empty purse weighing against her hip like a stone. "Of course you do." Fletcher set the coin on the bench beside her carpetbag. "That's just Western hospitality." He retreated to his office, leaving Eleanor alone with the vast Wyoming sky. It stretched endlessly, a blue so sharp it hurt to look at, nothing like Boston's familiar gray ceiling. Here the sky didn't care about your circumstances. It simply was, beautiful and terrible and completely indifferent. She picked up the silver dollar, its weight both salvation and defeat. The sound of voices made her turn. 2 men stumbled from the saloon across the street, their laughter too loud, their steps uneven with whiskey. When they spotted her, their conversation halted, replaced by something darker that raised the hairs on the back of Eleanor's neck. "Well now, what's this?" The taller one nudged his companion. "That the male bride, still waiting?" Eleanor gripped her bag closer, calculating the distance to Fletcher's office. The door was closed, the windows reflecting only the brutal afternoon sun. "Pretty little thing," the shorter man said, swaggering toward the platform. "Shame to waste all that proper Boston breeding on some rancher who can't even bother to show up." She stood, keeping the bench between them. "Please leave me be." "Oh, she's polite too." The taller man grinned, revealing a missing front tooth. "We could use some politeness. Couldn't we, Deke?" "Sure could." Deke reached for her bag. "Let me help you with that, ma'am. A lady shouldn't carry her own things." Eleanor pulled back. I said, leave me be. The taller man grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron. Now that ain't very polite at all. His breath was sour with whiskey. Maybe Miller got a look at your true nature and changed his mind. Stop it! A child's voice rang out, so unexpected that all three adults froze. She's with us. Standing at the edge of the platform was a girl, maybe 8 years old, wearing men's boots that swallowed her feet in a dress that had seen better decades. Prairie dust painted her dark hair gray, and her eyes were the color of sage honey, too knowing for such a young face. This ain't your concern, little Callahan, Deke said, but his hand dropped from Eleanor's bag. The girl tilted her chin defiantly. My pa's waiting, and he don't like waiting, especially not for women we're expecting. She turned to Eleanor. Come on, Miss Bennett. Pa sent me to fetch you. Train's been and gone, and you weren't on it. Eleanor stared at the child, confusion warring with the instinct to seize any escape. The girl's eyes widened slightly, a silent plea. Yes, of course, Eleanor said, finding her voice. Please tell your father I apologize for the delay. The men exchanged glances. Everyone in Dustmere knew the Callahans, it seemed, and whatever they knew made them step back. Didn't realize she was from Matthew Callahan, the taller one muttered. Man's got ice where his heart should be. And a rifle that don't miss, Deke added. Come on, Harv. They retreated, casting dark glances over their shoulders as they stumbled back toward the saloon. The girl waited until they disappeared inside, then approached Eleanor, her oversized boots clomping against the boards. You're really her, aren't you? The lady who's been waiting for Miller? The child studied her like she was a puzzle missing pieces. You've been sitting here 3 days. Whole town's talking about it. Eleanor knelt to the girl's level, suddenly aware of how strange this encounter was. How do you know my name? Everybody knows, Fletcher told Pa. She thrust out a small, dirt-stained hand. I'm Lily, Lily Callahan. Eleanor shook the tiny hand, feeling calluses no child should have. And who is Matthew Callahan? My pa. Lily's gaze was direct, assessing. He don't know I'm here, but I heard him talking with Fletcher about the Boston lady being swindled and how it wasn't right to leave you sitting here for the vultures. Your father sent you to help me? Lily looked down, scuffing one enormous boot against the platform. Not exactly. He's too proud to offer help directly. Says people need to make their own way. She glanced up. But he wouldn't turn away someone who needed shelter, especially not with snow coming. Eleanor looked at the perfectly clear sky. Snow? Lily nodded solemnly. Pa can smell it. Says it'll be here by nightfall. She paused. Miller isn't real, you know. It's a swindle Beck and Thornton run. You're the third lady this year. The matter-of-fact way the child delivered this blow made it somehow worse. Eleanor's cheeks burned with humiliation. How do you know all this? Pa used to be a newspaper man before. Lily trailed off, then squared her small shoulders. Look, you need somewhere to go and we could use help. Pa can't braid hair, and he burns everything he cooks. A smile tugged at Eleanor's lips despite everything. And he'd welcome a strange woman into his home? Well, welcome might be stretching it. Lily's honesty was refreshing. But he won't turn you away, not with snow coming. And She hesitated, vulnerability breaking through her precocious facade. I could use some female company. The coin in Eleanor's palm seemed to grow heavier. Back to Boston and a lifetime of pity, or forward into yet another unknown with this strange, solemn child. Your father might be very angry to find you've invited a stranger home. Lily shrugged. Pa's always a little angry, has been since Mama died, but he's fair. Her eyes held Eleanor's, too old for her years. You coming or not? It's 3 miles and those boots aren't made for walking. Eleanor glanced at her fashionable city boots, already showing wear from 3 days on the platform. Then at the empty track stretching east, the promise of retreat. Finally at the small, determined face before her, offering not charity, but an exchange, shelter for skills. Yes, she said, the decision feeling momentous in ways she couldn't articulate. I'm coming. Lily nodded, all business now. Good, I can carry your bag. I'm stronger than I look. I'm sure you are, Eleanor said, but kept her grip on the carpet bag. We'll take turns. They set off, leaving the station and its broken promises behind. Dustmere wasn't much of a town, a collection of wooden buildings that looked like they'd been dropped from the sky and landed wherever they pleased. The saloon leaked piano music and laughter. The general store's windows displayed goods Eleanor couldn't afford. People watched them pass, the abandoned bride following the Callahan girl like a lost sheep. "Don't mind them," Lily said, noticing Eleanor's discomfort. "They got nothing better to do than stare." Mrs. Holloway once watched Mr. Giles scratch his backside for 10 whole minutes just because it was Tuesday and nothing else was happening. Despite everything, Eleanor smiled. "You're very observant." "Pa says I notice too much. Says it ain't ladylike." Lily corrected herself with obvious effort. "Isn't. Mama used to say isn't instead of ain't. She was from Boston, too." "Was she?" Eleanor's interest piqued. "When did she pass?" "2 winters ago. Fever took her right before Christmas." The girl's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Pa wrapped all the presents she'd hidden, but his hand shook so bad the paper tore. I pretended not to notice." Eleanor's heart constricted. "That was kind of you." Lily shrugged again, that too-old gesture. "Everything got complicated after Mama died." They left the town behind, following a rutted wagon trail into the grassland. The prairie stretched endless, grass rippling like water in the wind. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still wearing caps of snow despite the autumn warmth. It was beautiful and terrifying. All that space, all that sky, making Eleanor feel small as a seed. There, ahead, was their destination. The Callahan Ranch squatted against the landscape like it was trying not to be noticed. The main house was built solid but simple. Logs chinked with mud, a porch that wrapped around 2 sides. A barn stood off to the left, its red paint fading to the color of dried blood. Smoke drifted from the chimney, the only sign of life. "That's home," Lily said, and for the first time, uncertainty crept into her voice. Maybe I should tell him first. Prepare him." Eleanor stopped, sudden doubt flooding her. "Lily, this isn't, I can't just—" But the girl had already darted ahead, her oversized boots kicking up dust. Eleanor stood frozen, watching as Lily disappeared inside, leaving her alone in the vast open with her carpet bag and fraying courage. Minutes passed. Eleanor considered turning back, but the thought of returning to that platform, to Fletcher's pity and the leering drunks, was unbearable. And besides, where would she go? The door opened. A man stepped onto the porch, tall enough to duck slightly under the doorframe. Even at a distance, Eleanor could see he was lean but solid, with shoulders built from labor rather than sport. Dark hair that needed cutting fell across his forehead, and a beard that needed trimming covered his jaw. But it was his eyes that stopped her breathing. Gray as winter storms, they held the kind of weariness that came from carrying too much weight for too long. Those eyes locked on her, and Eleanor saw confusion, then alarm, then something that might have been fear. Lily reappeared at his side, speaking urgently, pointing toward Eleanor. The man, Matthew Callahan, listened without taking his gaze from the stranger on his land. Eleanor raised her chin, clutching her bag like armor. If he turned her away, so be it. She'd survive worse than the rejection of a stranger. Matthew said something to his daughter, who nodded and retreated inside. Then he descended the porch steps and walked toward Eleanor with long, deliberate strides that ate up the distance between them. Up close, he was even more imposing, not just in height, but in presence. He carried himself like a man used to the world's harshness, expecting nothing better. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice deep and rough from disuse. His Chicago accent was faint but detectable beneath the Western cadence. "My daughter says you need shelter." It wasn't a question, but Eleanor answered anyway. "Only temporarily, until I can make other arrangements." Matthew studied her, those storm-gray eyes taking in her dusty dress, her worn boots, the proud tilt of her chin despite it all. "Lily says you've been at the station 3 days. That Miller never showed." Humiliation burned in Eleanor's chest. "It seems I was misled about certain opportunities in Wyoming territory." A muscle jumped in Matthew's jaw. "James Miller doesn't exist. It's a scheme Thornton and Beck have been running. You're not the first." "So your daughter informed me." Eleanor's grip tightened on her bag. I don't require charity, Mr. Callahan. I'm willing to work for my keep until the next eastbound train. When's that? Mr. Fletcher mentioned sometime next week, weather permitting. Matthew glanced at the sky, his eyes narrowing at the perfectly blue expanse. Snow's coming, might delay the trains further. Eleanor followed his gaze, seeing nothing but clear skies. How can you possibly know that? A ghost of something, not quite a smile, touched his lips. Been on this land long enough, you feel it in your bones. He returned his attention to her. You a teacher? Surprised by the shift, Eleanor nodded. In Boston, 8 years. Lily needs schooling. I do what I can, but he trailed off, then seemed to make a decision. You can stay until the next train. Room and board in exchange for teaching my daughter. Nothing more. Relief flooded through Eleanor, quickly followed by wariness. A single man, an isolated ranch. Her hesitation must have shown on her face. You'll have the spare room, Matthew said flatly, with a lock. I sleep in the barn most nights anyway. The barn, bud. That's the arrangement. Take it or leave it. His bluntness was almost refreshing after months of veiled Bostonian niceties. Eleanor extended her hand, the way she'd seen her father close business deals. I accept your terms, Mr. Callahan. Matthew looked at her hand for a moment before taking it. His palm was rough with calluses, warm despite the cooling air. The handshake was brief, firm, and oddly formal, given the circumstances. 1 week, he said, then we'll reassess. He turned and started back toward the house, clearly expecting her to follow. Eleanor took a deep breath, picked up her carpet bag, and stepped into her new temporary life. The interior of the Callahan home was a study in masculine utility. Everything served a purpose. The large fireplace that dominated one wall, the solid table that had seen better decades, the furniture that prioritized function over comfort. But the space was meticulously clean, everything in rigid order, as if someone was afraid chaos would creep in if given the slightest opportunity. Lily waited inside, practically vibrating with excitement. You're staying. For a week, Matthew corrected, hanging his hat on a peg by the door, while she teaches you proper letters and numbers. And hair braiding? Lily asked hopefully. Miss Bennett looks like she knows how to braid hair pretty. Matthew's expression softened when he looked at his daughter, the first genuine emotion Eleanor had seen from him. If Miss Bennett agrees, that too. I'd be happy to, Eleanor said, earning a brilliant smile from Lily. The spare room is through there. Matthew nodded toward the door off the main room. Lily, show Miss Bennett where she can wash up. I'll see to dinner. You'll burn it, Lily stated matter-of-factly. Then I'll burn it, he agreed, the ghost of that not-quite smile appearing again. But we'll eat all the same. Lily led Eleanor to a narrow door, opening it with a flourish. This was their room, she said unnecessarily. Daddy sleeps in the barn most nights now. Says the house feels too full of empty. The room Lily led her to had clearly been the master bedroom once. Now it held only a narrow bed, a washstand, and a trunk. Everything that might have been feminine had been removed, leaving only the bones of a space once filled with life. This was their room, Lily said unnecessarily. Daddy sleeps in the barn most nights now. Says the house feels too full of empty. Eleanor poured water from the pitcher into the basin, surprised to find it fresh and warm. Your father seems complicated. He wasn't always. Lily perched on the bed, watching Eleanor wash the travel dust from her face and hands. Mama used to make him laugh, real laughs, the kind that came from his belly. Now he just works and worries and forgets to eat unless I remind him. The child's insight was heartbreaking. Eleanor dried her hands slowly, choosing her words with care. Grief changes people. I know it changed me too. You lost someone? My mother when I was 15, then my father 2 years later. Lily considered this. I'm sorry, does it get easier, missing people? Eleanor sat beside the girl, the mattress dipping under their combined weight. Not easier, different, like learning to write with your other hand. It never feels quite right, but eventually you can make words again. Lily nodded solemnly. That makes sense. I should change before Daddy gets upset. He doesn't like disorder. Left alone, Eleanor surveyed the sparse room. Every missing detail told a story. The rectangular fate on the wall where a mirror once hung, the empty hooks that might have held dresses, the lingering scent of lavender sachets long since removed. She opened her carpet bag, pulling out her one clean dress. It was nothing special, dark blue wool, practical and plain, but it was clean and it fit, and it didn't carry the dust of her humiliation. When she returned to the main room, Matthew was at the stove, stirring something in a large pot with the concentration of a man diffusing dynamite. Lily sat at the table, now wearing a dress that was clean but too small, the hem hitting above her ankles. "It smells wonderful," Eleanor said, though in truth it smelled slightly scorched. Matthew glanced at her and something flickered in those storm gray eyes. The blue dress, perhaps, or just the sight of a woman in his kitchen again. "It's edible," he said, usually. "Daddy's being modest," Lily said. "It's definitely edible, mostly." Despite herself, Eleanor found her lips twitching toward a smile. "May I help?" "No," the word came out sharp, and Matthew seemed to realize it. "I mean, you're a guest." "I'm a woman who knows her way around a kitchen, Mr. Callahan, and I've been sitting for 3 days. I'd welcome the activity." He stepped back from the stove like it might bite him. "If you insist." She moved to the pot, assessing the situation. The stew was salvageable, just needed attention. She found salt, pepper, and surprisingly dried herbs hanging from the rafters. "Thyme," she said, surprised, "and sage." "Mama grew them," Lily explained. "Daddy keeps them even though he doesn't use them. She said they made everything taste like home." "She was right," Matthew said quietly, then seemed surprised he'd spoken. Eleanor added herbs to the stew, adjusting seasoning, stirring with the confidence of someone who'd stretched too many meals when money was tight. The familiar rhythm of cooking settled her nerves, gave her hands something to do besides twist together in anxiety. "You know what you're doing," Matthew observed. "My mother taught me. She said a woman who can't cook is like a bird who can't fly, capable of surviving but missing something essential." "Your mother sounds wise." "She was," Eleanor kept stirring, not looking at him. "Consumption took her when I was 15. My father followed 2 years later. Heart gave out, the doctor said, but I think it was grief. Some people aren't meant to be alone." The kitchen fell silent, except for the bubble of stew and the pop of wood in the fireplace. Lily watched the adults like they were performing a play she didn't quite understand but desperately wanted to see the ending of. "The bread's in the warming box," Matthew said finally, "if you want to slice it." They worked in careful parallel, not quite together but not apart, navigating the kitchen like dancers who'd forgotten the steps but still heard the music. Eleanor found plates, Lily set the table, Matthew poured water from a pitcher that didn't quite shake in his hands. The stew was better than edible, it was good. The elk meat was tender. The vegetables, root vegetables that had wintered in some cellar, gave it substance, and the herbs brought a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. "This is how Mama made it," Lily said, wonder in her voice. Exactly how she made it. Matthew's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. He set it down carefully, precisely like it was made of glass. "I should check the horses," he said, standing abruptly. "Daddy, you haven't finished." But he was gone, the door closing with careful control behind him. Lily's face crumpled. "I shouldn't have said that about Mama. I always say the wrong thing." "No, sweetheart." Eleanor reached across the table, covering the girl's small hand with her own. "You said exactly the right thing. Sometimes the right things are just the hardest to hear." They finished eating in companionable silence, Lily sneaking glances at the door, waiting for her father to return. He didn't. "He goes to talk to her," Lily explained as they cleared the dishes. "In the barn. Her grave's out back. But he says the barn's where he feels her most. They built it together before I was born." Eleanor washed while Lily dried, the domestic rhythm strangely soothing. This wasn't her house, wasn't her life, but for just this moment she could pretend it was. Pretend she belonged somewhere, was needed by someone, had a purpose beyond being the woman foolish enough to believe in fairy tale letters. "You should stay," Lily said suddenly. "Not forever if you don't want, but for a while, until you figure out where else to go." "Lily, we have room. That bedroom you're in, nobody uses it. And Daddy needs help, even if he won't say so. The ranch is too much for one man. He's exhausted all the time, and he won't hire hands because he says he can't afford them. But really, I think he just doesn't want strangers around. The girl dried a plate with focused intensity. You wouldn't be a stranger. You'd be useful. I don't know anything about ranching. You can learn. Mama did. She was from Boston, remember? Never seen a cow until she met Daddy, but she learned everything. How to birth calves, mend fences, break horses. Daddy taught her, and he could teach you too. Your father doesn't want. My father doesn't know what he wants anymore, Lily said with that unnerving insight. He's like a clock that stopped working when Mama died. Still tells time twice a day, but that's just coincidence, not function. The door opened before Eleanor could respond. Matthew stood into the doorway, backlit by the dying light, and for a moment he looked like a spirit himself, caught between worlds, not quite present in either. Storm's coming, he said. Can smell it on the wind. Miss Bennett, you'll stay tonight. Can't have you walking back in weather. I couldn't impose. Already imposed, he said bluntly. Might as well impose until morning when it's safe to travel. Lily made a small sound of victory that she tried to disguise as a cough. Matthew's eyes narrowed at his daughter, reading her plotting as clearly as text. Just tonight, Lily. Miss Bennett has her own life to figure out. Yes, Daddy, Lily said meekly, but her eyes danced with plans. The evening settled around them like a blanket. Matthew returned to work, ledgers spread across the table, calculating numbers that never seemed to add up right. Lily sat by the fire with a primer, practicing her letters with painful concentration. Eleanor found herself darning stockings she discovered in a basket, the kind of mindless work that let her thoughts wander. This could be her life, this quiet domesticity, this careful dance around grief, this slowly healing household. It was nothing like what she'd imagined when she'd answered James Miller's advertisement, with its promises of romance and adventure and a grand love story across the frontier. This was just life. Complicated, messy, difficult life with real people who carried real pain and real needs. Your letters are backward, Matthew told Lily, his voice gentle. Remember, the B faces right, like it's walking forward. Walking forward to where? Lily asked. Wherever it needs to go. What if it doesn't know where that is? Matthew looked up from his ledgers, caught Lily's eyes. Then his gaze drifted to Eleanor. Then it keeps walking until it figures it out. The storm hit just after full dark, wind howling like wounded animals, rain hammering the roof with violent intensity. The house shuddered but held, built to withstand worse than weather. Spring storms, Matthew said, closing his ledgers. They're angry about something, but they never last long. Unlike winter storms? Eleanor asked. Winter storms aren't angry, he replied. They're just indifferent, which is worse somehow. He stood, stretching muscles tired from sitting. I'll get blankets for your room. Gets cold when the wind blows through the chinking. He disappeared into a back room, leaving Eleanor and Lily by the fire. He's different tonight, Lily whispered. He talked more at dinner than he has in weeks. Change unsettles people. Good unsettled or bad unsettled? I don't know yet. Matthew returned with an armload of quilts that smelled of cedar and thyme. These were in the trunk, he said, not quite meeting Eleanor's eyes. They're clean. One quilt slipped, and Eleanor caught it. Her fingers recognized the pattern immediately. Wedding ring design. Each interlocking circle made with fabric scraps that told stories. A piece of yellow that might have been a summer dress, blue from a work shirt, white that could have been christening clothes. She made that, Matthew said quietly. Hannah, my wife. She said every quilt should tell the truth about the life that made it. What truth does this one tell? He was quiet so long Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. Then, that even scraps can make something beautiful if you're patient enough to piece them together. Lily yawned elaborately. I'm tired, Daddy, really tired. Matthew's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. Bed then, both of you. He lit a lamp for Eleanor, handed it to her with hands that weren't quite steady. Thank you, he said, for dinner, for making it taste like home again. Before she could respond, he was gone. Back into the storm, probably to the barn where he could talk to ghosts without witnesses. Lily showed Eleanor to the spare room. That's what they were calling it now. Not the room where Hannah died, just the spare room. It was clean but cold, the wind finding every gap in the logs to whistle through. There's a warming pan under the bed, and Lily said, and if you get scared, you can come to my room. Sometimes I get scared and go to Daddy's room, but he's usually not there, so I just curl up in his empty bed and pretend. Pretend what? Different things. Sometimes that Mama's just in the kitchen making breakfast. Sometimes that Daddy's the way he used to be. Sometimes that I'm brave enough not to need pretending. She hugged Eleanor suddenly, fiercely, her small arms surprisingly strong. Please stay, she whispered. Not for marriage or forever or anything big. Just stay for a little while. We're so tired of being alone. Then she was gone, leaving Eleanor in a dead woman's room with a storm raging outside and a different kind of storm building inside. She sat on the narrow bed, still holding the wedding ring quilt. Every stitch represented hours of work, of care, of love transformed into something tangible. Hannah Callahan had made this while alive, vibrant, probably humming while she worked. Now it was all that remained of those hands, that heart, that life cut short. Eleanor thought about her own trunk, sold to pay for the journey west, about the quilts her mother had made, also sold, about all the pieces of her life she'd scattered behind her like breadcrumbs, hoping they'd lead somewhere better than where she'd started. The storm raged on, and somewhere in the barn, a man was talking to his dead wife about the woman sitting in her room, wrapped in her quilt, wearing a blue dress that probably reminded him of 100 other blue dresses that would never be worn again. This wasn't the adventure Eleanor had imagined. It wasn't the romance James Miller had promised in his fictitious letters. It was harder and sadder and more real than anything she'd prepared for. But it was also warm and dry and safe. There was food and shelter and a little girl who needed someone to braid her hair. There was a man drowning in grief who'd still offered kindness to a stranger. There was work that needed doing and a place that needed filling. Not replacing Hannah Callahan, that was impossible, but simply being present in the space her absence had created. The lamp flickered, casting shadows that danced on the walls. Outside, the storm began to ease, its anger spent. Tomorrow she could leave, take Matthew's carefully offered escape, and walk back to the station, back to decisions about east or west, about what came next for a woman with no money and no prospects and no fairy tale ending waiting. Or she could stay, not forever. Lily was right about that, but for a while, long enough to help with spring planting, long enough to teach Lily proper letters, long enough to see if Matthew Callahan could remember how to be more than a ghost haunting his own life, long enough to figure out if Eleanor Bennett was meant to be more than just a forgotten bride on a train platform. She pulled the quilt around her shoulders, its weight comforting as an embrace. In the pattern of interlocking rings, she traced the outline of one circle completing itself, but stronger for its connection to the others. The wind whispered through the logs, and if she listened carefully, she could almost hear it saying something that sounded like "welcome home." But that was just fancy, just the kind of romantic notion that had gotten her in trouble in the first place. This wasn't home. It was just shelter in a storm. Still, as she lay down in the narrow bed, still wearing her blue dress because unpacking felt too much like commitment, she allowed herself one small moment of possibility. Maybe not all promises were lies. Maybe some were just delayed, taking forms you didn't expect, arriving through the voice of a child in oversized boots instead of letters from non-existent ranchers. Thunder rolled across the prairie one last time, and in its echo, Eleanor heard the sound of her old life ending and something else. Unknown, uncertain, but undeniably real. Beginning. Morning arrived with the kind of pristine clarity that only follows storms, as if the world had been scrubbed clean and hung out to dry. Eleanor woke to find sunlight streaming through gaps in the logs, painting golden stripes across the wedding ring quilt. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The narrow bed, the unfamiliar walls, the lingering scent of another woman's life, all seemed part of some elaborate dream. Then she heard Lily's voice drifting from the kitchen, high and bright. "Daddy, you're burning the eggs again." Reality settled back around her like a comfortable weight. Eleanor dressed quickly in yesterday's blue dress, her only clean one now, and tried to tame her hair into something resembling respectability. The small mirror above the washstand showed a woman she barely recognized, cheeks flushed from prairie wind, eyes that had lost their city pallor, the beginning of something that might have been determination setting around her mouth. The kitchen scene that greeted her was one of controlled chaos. Matthew stood at the stove, spatula in hand, looking at a pan of eggs like they'd personally betrayed him. Lily sat at the table, already dressed but with her hair resembling a bird's nest after a particularly violent windstorm. "Good morning," Eleanor said, and both Callahans turned to her with identical expressions of relief. "Miss Bennet," Matthew said, his formality at odds with the dawn light softening his features, "I was attempting breakfast." "Attempting is the right word," Lily added helpfully. Without thinking, Eleanor moved to the stove, gently taking the spatula from Matthew's hand. Their fingers brushed just barely, just enough for her to feel the calluses from years of rope and leather, the warmth that radiated from skin used to working in all weather. "May I?" she asked. He stepped back immediately, almost gratefully. "Please." The eggs were indeed burned, but salvageable if you scraped carefully and didn't mind a slightly smoky flavor. She worked quietly, aware of Matthew's eyes on her as she moved around his kitchen with increasing confidence. "I can braid your hair after breakfast," she told Lily, who bounced in her seat with delight. "Really? Proper braids? The kind that stay?" "The very kind." Matthew poured coffee from a pot that looked like it had been percolating since the beginning of time, the liquid black as tar and probably twice as thick. He set a cup near Eleanor's elbow, not handed to her directly, she noticed, but placed within reach. Everything he did seemed to maintain that careful distance, as if getting too close might disturb something fragile. They ate in relative quiet, but it was a different silence than the night before. This had the quality of morning routine, of people settling into patterns. Lily chattered about the horses, about a hawk she'd seen hunting mice, about anything that crossed her quick mind. Matthew responded with nods and occasional words, but his attention seemed split between his daughter and the woman who'd materialized in his kitchen, like something conjured from desperate need. After breakfast, Eleanor sat Lily down and began working through the tangles in her hair. The child winced but didn't complain, too pleased with the attention to protest the necessary discomfort. "Mama used to sing when she braided my hair," Lily said softly. Eleanor's hands stilled for just a moment. "What did she sing?" "Church songs mostly, sometimes funny ones about frogs and princes." Lily tilted her head back to look at Eleanor upside down. "Do you know any songs?" "A few. Will you sing them?" Eleanor glanced at Matthew, who had returned to his ledgers but was clearly listening. His shoulders were tight, braced as if for a blow. "Perhaps another time," she said gently, resuming her braiding, "when I've remembered all the words properly." Matthew's shoulders relaxed incrementally. She'd passed some unspoken test, respecting boundaries she was only beginning to understand. The morning developed its own rhythm. Lily showed Eleanor around the house, every corner, every hiding place, every squeaky board that might wake someone if you were trying to sneak to the kitchen for midnight water. The root cellar with its stores of potatoes and turnips and mysterious preserves in jars whose labels had long since faded. The smokehouse where meat hung like strange curtains. "Daddy built all this," Lily said proudly. "Him and Mama together, but mostly him. He's good at building things, just not so good at maintaining them lately." Indeed, Eleanor could see the signs of neglect, not willful, but the kind that came from one person trying to do the work of two. Fence posts that leaned like tired soldiers, gates that hung askew, a chicken coop that had seen better decades. "We used to have chickens," Lily explained, following Eleanor's gaze. "But after Mama died, a fox got in. Daddy just never replaced them. Said it was one less thing to worry about, but I think he just couldn't bear to start something new." When they were interrupted by the sound of horses approaching, Matthew appeared from the barn, rifle in hand, his whole body alert. But it was just a neighbor, Mr. Henley from the adjacent ranch, his weathered face creased with what might have been concern or curiosity. "Matt," he called out, not dismounting. "Heard you had company." News traveled fast on the prairie, Eleanor realized. Probably Mrs. Holloway's doing, the boarding house keeper Fletcher had mentioned. "Miss Bennet," Matthew said simply. "She's teaching Lily for a spell." Henley's eyes found Eleanor, took in her clean dress and Lily's neatly braided hair, and something knowing flickered across his features. "The bride from the station," he said. "Just Miss Bennett," Matthew corrected, his tone carrying a warning. "Of course," Henley touched his hat brim to Eleanor. "Ma'am, welcome to the territory. Rough land, but it grows on you if you give it time." "Like a fungus," Lily added helpfully, earning a sharp look from her father. Henley chuckled. "That's one way to put it." His eyes returned to Eleanor. "I'm headed to town later if you need passage back to the station." The offer hung in the air like a challenge. Eleanor felt both men watching her, waiting for her decision. Even Lily had gone still, her small body tense with hope she was trying not to show. "That's very kind, Mr. Henley," Eleanor said carefully. "But Mr. Callahan has offered me temporary employment. I'll be staying on for a while to help with the household." Matthew's head turned sharply toward her. They hadn't discussed this, hadn't agreed to anything beyond breakfast, but she met his storm-gray eyes steadily, chin lifted slightly, as if daring him to contradict her in front of his neighbor. "Employment," Henley repeated, his tone suggesting he wasn't buying it for a second. "Well, that's practical." "Very practical," Matthew agreed, though his voice carried undercurrents Eleanor couldn't quite read. "Miss Bennett has experience with household management." "I'm sure she does." Henley's smile was just shy of a smirk. "Well, if you need anything, Miss Bennett, the Henley Ranch is just 5 miles east. My wife would be pleased to have female company. It's lonely for the women out here." After he left, trailing dust and unspoken speculation, Matthew turned to Eleanor with an expression that mixed confusion, irritation, and something that might have been reluctant admiration. "Employment, Bum?" he asked. "Would you prefer I'd taken his offer of a ride?" "I—" He stopped, clearly wrestling with himself. "We can't pay much. Room and board would be sufficient. You don't even know what the work entails." "I can learn. Ranch work is hard." "Mr. Callahan," Eleanor interrupted, surprising herself with her firmness. "I've been sitting on a train platform for 3 days, waiting for a man who doesn't exist, with every person in town watching my humiliation. I can handle hard work. What I can't handle is more pity." He studied her for a long moment, seeing perhaps for the first time not the desperate woman from the station, but someone else. Someone with steel beneath the desperation. "3 months, he said finally. "Trial period. If it doesn't work for any of us, you're free to go with no hard feelings and a month's wages to see you wherever you need to go." "Agreed." Lily, who'd been holding her breath, exploded into motion, hugging Eleanor's waist with fierce joy. "You're staying. You're really staying." "For now," Matthew cautioned. But his daughter wasn't listening, already chattering about all the things she could show Eleanor, all the ways life would be better now. The rest of the day fell into what Eleanor would later recognize as the beginning of a pattern. Matthew worked the ranch, checking cattle, mending the worst of the fences, the endless labor of keeping civilization carved out of wilderness. Lily shadowed Eleanor as she took inventory of the house, making lists of what needed doing, what could wait, what was beyond saving. The kitchen was well stocked but disorganized, as if someone had been putting things away in the dark. The main room needed attention. Dusty corners, windows that hadn't been cleaned since Hannah died, curtains that were more suggestion than fabric. But the bones of the house were good, solid, built to last by hands that cared about permanence. "Mama's sewing basket is in the trunk," Lily offered when Eleanor mentioned the curtains. "Daddy won't mind if you use it, I don't think." The trunk sat at the foot of Matthew's bed, the bed he rarely slept in, like a closed door to the past. Eleanor hesitated before opening it, feeling like an intruder, but practicality won. Inside, Hannah Callahan's life lay folded and waiting, fabric, thread, needles, half-finished projects that would never be completed by the hands that started them. There was also a photograph wrapped carefully in silk. A woman with Lily's honey eyes and Matthew's determined chin, wearing a dress that managed to be both practical and pretty. She was smiling at something beyond the camera's range, probably at Matthew himself directing the photographer. She looked happy, not the forced happiness of formal portraits, but genuinely, radiantly alive. "That's her," Lily said from the doorway. "That's Mama. She was beautiful." "She was," Eleanor agreed, carefully rewrapping the photograph. Some things weren't ready to be disturbed. That afternoon, Eleanor explored the ledgers Matthew had been poring over the night before. As a teacher, she had a knack for numbers, and she quickly saw the problem. The ranch was behind on taxes, nearly $200 worth, and if not paid soon, they risked foreclosure. She was still studying the books when Matthew returned from the fields, his face taut with exhaustion. He stopped short seeing her at his desk, his private financial struggles laid bare before a stranger. "I apologize for the intrusion," Eleanor said quickly. "I was looking for paper for Lily's lessons." He moved to the desk, scanning what she'd been reading, then sighed heavily. "Now you know why I can't pay you much." "The situation isn't hopeless," she offered. "With some reorganization, I don't need charity accounting, Miss Bennett." His pride was a tangible thing, thick as the walls of his house. Eleanor chose her next words carefully. "I taught mathematics, Mr. Callahan, for 8 years. It's not charity to use the skills one has." Something shifted in his expression. Not softening exactly, but perhaps recognition. He nodded once, a sharp dip of his chin. "I'd welcome the help then." It wasn't friendship or warmth, but it was a crack in the wall he'd built around himself. Eleanor would take it. That evening, as they ate a stew Eleanor had managed to prepare without burning, Lily dominated the conversation with plans for her education. Her enthusiasm was infectious, even drawing a few almost smiles from her father. "And Miss Bennett says we'll have real copybooks, not just slate, so I can keep my lessons forever." "That's fine, Lilybird," Matthew said, the endearment slipping out naturally. "But don't overtax Miss Bennett all at once." "I won't," Lily promised, "but I have so many questions. Like, why do we say rough and through different when they end the same?" Eleanor launched into an explanation of English orthography that somehow led to a discussion of Latin roots, which segued into Roman history. Matthew listened silently, but she could feel his attention, sharp and evaluating. When she finally paused, realizing she'd been lecturing, he spoke. "Your pupils in Boston were fortunate." The compliment, unexpected and gruffly delivered, warmed her more than it should have. "They didn't always appreciate it," she admitted, "especially the boys who'd rather be apprenticing than conjugating verbs." "Did you like teaching?" The question surprised her. In Boston, people rarely asked what she liked, only what was proper, expected, suitable. "I did," she said, considering. "I liked the moment when a child's face changed, that instant when confusion became understanding. It felt like being there when a door opened." Matthew nodded as if this made perfect sense to him. "My father was a teacher back in Chicago," said the same thing. It was the first personal detail he'd volunteered, and Eleanor treasured it like a rare coin. After dinner, Lily brought out a small wooden checkerboard. "Will you play with me, Miss Bennett? Daddy never loses, but maybe you would sometimes." Eleanor glanced at Matthew, who shrugged slightly. "She needs to learn that losing isn't the worst thing." They played 3 games, Eleanor winning the first honestly, losing the second also honestly, and tying the third after a hard-fought battle that left Lily glowing with pride. "You're good," the girl declared, "almost as good as Daddy." A dubious distinction, Matthew said, but his eyes held something like amusement. When Lily went to bed, Eleanor expected Matthew to retreat to the barn as he had the night before. Instead, he remained by the fire, staring into the flames as if they contained messages only he could read. "She likes you," he said after a long silence. "I like her too. It's been a long time since she's had a woman to look up to." Eleanor hesitated, then ventured, "You've done well with her. She's bright, curious, kind." "That's Hannah's doing." And children aren't sculpted only by the parent who bore them, Mr. Callahan. They're shaped by everyone who loves them. He looked at her then, really looked at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "You speak from experience?" "I had a father who believed girls' minds were as valuable as boys'. It made all the difference in who I became." Matthew nodded slowly. "I want that for Lily, to know her mind matters." "Then you're already giving her what she needs most." Silence fell again, but it was different now, companionable rather than strained. "May I ask about your wife?" Eleanor ventured finally. His body tensed, but he didn't shut down as she'd feared. "What do you want to know?" "How you met?" A shadow of a smile touched his lips. "At a lecture in Chicago. I was reporting on it for the Tribune. a talk by a visiting dignitary from Boston. Hannah was there with her father, a banker. She asked the most incisive question of the evening, left the poor diplomat stammering. She was intelligent then, brilliant and fearless. When I approached her afterward for a quote, she gave me one that would have gotten us both in trouble if I'd printed it verbatim. His voice had softened, lost some of its habitual roughness. 2 weeks later, I proposed. That quickly? When you know, Miss Bennett, you know. He looked back to the fire. We came west 6 months later. Her parents disowned her for marrying a newspaperman with frontier aspirations. I think they hoped she'd come crawling back when she experienced real hardship. His jaw tightened. She never did. She loved it here. She made herself love it. Hannah could make herself love anything if she decided to. That was her gift, seeing potential where others saw nothing. He blinked as if surprised by how much he'd revealed. It's late. I should check the horses. But he didn't move immediately, and neither did Eleanor. They sat in the firelight a moment longer, suspended in a fragile space where the past was not quite so painful, and the present not quite so uncertain. Finally, Matthew stood, his movements deliberate. Good night, Miss Bennett. Good night, Mr. Callahan. As his footsteps faded toward the barn, Eleanor remained by the fire, thinking of a brilliant Boston woman who'd chosen love over comfort, adventure over security, who'd learned to birth calves and mend fences and make a home from wilderness, who died anyway, leaving behind a child with her eyes and a husband with a hole in his life the shape of her absence. Eleanor wondered if Hannah had ever regretted her choice, in those quiet moments when the prairie wind howled and city comforts seemed a distant dream. She wondered if she herself would have the courage to make such a leap, not for a fictional James Miller, but for something real, something that required giving pieces of oneself away with no guarantee of return. She fell asleep that night in Hannah's bed, under Hannah's quilt, thinking of paths not taken and doors unexpectedly opened. In her dreams, she stood at a crossroads, one path leading back to Boston's familiar streets, the other into Wyoming's wild unknown. A woman she'd never met but somehow recognized stood at the western fork, not beckoning, but waiting as if to say, this way is harder, but the view is worth the climb. The days that followed developed a rhythm. Mornings began with breakfast, increasingly edible as Eleanor took over the cooking, followed by lessons for Lily at the kitchen table. The girl was a voracious learner, soaking up knowledge like the parched earth absorbed rain. Afternoons saw Eleanor tackling household tasks while Lily helped her father with lighter ranch chores. Evenings were for reading, games, and increasingly, conversation. Matthew remained reserved, but the wall around him showed more cracks each day. He began to linger at the breakfast table rather than hurrying out. He asked about Lily's lessons, offered stories from his newspaper, days even, on occasion, laughed, a rusty sound, like a gate that hadn't been opened in years. One evening, a week into her stay, he handed Eleanor a small stack of papers. What's this? She asked. A letter to the Tribune about the land dispute with the railroad. I thought you might look it over. Your grammar's better than mine. It was a peace offering, an acknowledgement, and she accepted it as such. The letter was well argued, his journalistic background evident in every paragraph, but she found a few places to strengthen his case. When she returned it, he read her suggestions carefully, nodding. You've a good eye, he said, clear thinking. I had an excellent teacher in that regard. My father never wrote a letter without having my mother review it first. They had a partnership then. The best kind, based on respect. Something flickered in his eyes, recognition perhaps, or memory. Hannah was the same. Never met a sentence she couldn't improve. The mention of his wife came more easily now, less like pulling a thorn from deep flesh. Progress, Eleanor thought. Small but real, but all was not well at the Callahan Ranch. 2 days later, a rider approached, not friendly Mr. Henley this time, but a hard-faced man in a too fine suit. Lily, who'd been collecting eggs from their newly repaired chicken coop, ran inside. It's Mr. Reed, she whispered, her face pale. The tax man. Eleanor looked to Matthew, who'd gone still, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. Take Lily to the back room, he said quietly. Stay there until I call. Matthew, please, Eleanor. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and it stopped her protest cold. She led Lily to the bedroom but left the door cracked enough to hear. The conversation wasn't long, but it was brutal in its clarity. Reed wanted 200 in back taxes within 30 days, or the Callahan Ranch would be seized. Matthew's argument that the assessment was inflated fell on deaf ears. Territory needs funds now, what with the railroad expansion and all. Reed's voice carried a smug finality. Of course, arrangements could be made. What kind of arrangements? Matthew's voice was dangerously quiet. My associate, Mr. Thornton, might be willing to take it off your hands for, say, $50. A fair price considering the circumstances. The ranch isn't for sale. Everything's for sale, Callahan. Just a matter of finding the right currency. There was a pause, and though Eleanor couldn't see, she could almost feel the tension crackling between the men. State your business or leave, Matthew said, each word careful and precise as a loaded gun. $200 by month's end, or I start foreclosure proceedings. The door slammed, followed by the sound of hoofbeats retreating. Eleanor waited a moment, then emerged with Lily. Matthew stood by the window watching Reed disappear into the distance, his body rigid with controlled fury. $200, he said to the empty air where Reed had been. Might as well ask for the moon. We'll find it, Eleanor said, though she'd seen the books and knew how impossible that amount was. Matthew turned to her, something raw in his expression. This isn't your debt to carry. No, but it's my home now, too. The words slipped out before she could catch them. Matthew went very still, and Lily looked between them with wide, hopeful eyes. He asked quietly. Before Eleanor could answer, Lily burst out, I have $17 saved from birthday money and finding Mr. Henley's lost calf. She thrust a small cloth bag at her father, the coins inside clinking dully. Matthew knelt, bringing himself to his daughter's eye level. Lilybird, I can't take your savings. It's not taking if I'm giving. This is our ranch, all of us. We protect what's ours. Eleanor watched the exchange, her heart constricting. What a remarkable child Hannah and Matthew had created, fierce and loving and wise beyond her years. That night, after Lily had gone to bed, Eleanor spread the ledgers across the kitchen table like battle plans. If we sell 20 head of cattle at current prices, we'd bring maybe $150, she calculated. We need another 50, minimum. The horses, Matthew said reluctantly, that bay mare would bring good money. The mare Lily's been training? The one she talks to every morning like it understands her? Horses don't care who owns them as long as they're fed. But Lily cares. Matthew rubbed his face, exhaustion carved into every line. Then what do you suggest? Because I'm out of ideas that don't involve losing something we love. Eleanor studied the numbers again, then looked up at the rafters where Hannah's herbs still hung, dry and fragrant. An idea began forming, wild and possibly foolish, but no more foolish than believing in letters from a non-existent rancher. What if we don't sell what we have? She said slowly. What if we add value to it instead? Speak plain. Mrs. Henley mentioned last week that she can't get good butter or cheese anywhere closer than Cheyenne. Same with preserves, pickled vegetables, anything that requires what she called a woman's touch. Eleanor leaned forward, warming to her plan. What if we didn't just sell cattle? What if we sold what we could make from what we have? That's work on top of work. Yes, but it's work I know how to do. My mother sold preserves and pickled goods when times were tight. I helped her from the time I could hold a stirring spoon. She gripped Matthew's arm, surprising them both with the contact. We have milk cows, a root cellar full of vegetables, wild berries growing by the creek. We just need sugar, vinegar, some canning supplies, and time. And someone to buy it all. The general store would take goods on consignment. I already asked Mr. Peterson hypothetically when I was in town last week. She'd actually been thinking about it since seeing the empty shelves where such goods should be. Dustmere was a growing town with families who wanted the comforts of home but lacked the time or skill to create them. Matthew was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor could practically see him weighing practicality against pride. It's not ranch work, he said finally. It's not what we do here. What you do here is survive, Eleanor countered, by whatever means necessary. We do this extra work on top of everything else. Lily can help. She's old enough. And you'd be surprised how much can be accomplished when foreclosure is the alternative. Matthew stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark land that 3 generations of Callahans had worked. My grandfather would roll in his grave, knowing I'd reduce the ranch to selling preserves like some homesteader's wife. Your grandfather isn't here, and I'd bet he'd rather see you keep the land through preserves than lose it through pride. When Matthew turned back, there was something different in his expression. Not quite hope, but the possibility of it. What would you need? They stayed up past midnight making lists, calculating costs, planning logistics. Matthew knew a supplier who might extend credit for canning supplies. Eleanor sketched out production schedules, working around ranch duties and Lily's schooling. It was ambitious, bordering on impossible, but it was something, and something was better than the nothing they'd had before. The next morning brought unexpected allies. Word of Reed's visit had traveled, Prairie Telegraph being faster than Western Union, and neighbors began arriving with small offerings and large indignation. Mr. Henley brought sugar, claiming his wife had ordered too much. The widow Patterson contributed a box of canning jars she couldn't possibly use all of. Even gruff old Pete from the furthest homestead brought vinegar, muttering about taxation being theft and Reed being a parasite. We take care of our own, Mrs. Henley said firmly, helping Eleanor sort supplies in the kitchen while Lily labeled jars with her careful handwriting. And you're one of us now, whether you arrived conventional or not. The work was brutal. Eleanor's days began before dawn, making breakfast, then immediately starting on whatever preserving project was most urgent. Strawberry jam from the wild berries Lily gathered, pickled vegetables from the garden they'd frantically expanded, butter churned until her arms ached, then molded into pretty pats that Mrs. Henley swore city folks would pay extra for. Matthew helped when he could, though ranch work didn't pause for side ventures. He'd find her in the kitchen at midnight, still stirring a pot of preserves and wordlessly take over so she could rest. Or she'd discover he'd already milked the cows at dawn, leaving the cream for her butter making. They developed a rhythm of cooperation that didn't require words, just understanding. Lily proved invaluable, her small fingers perfect for detailed work like tying cloth covers on jars with ribbon. She also had an unexpected talent for sales, charming customers at the general store with earnest descriptions of how the preserves were made with love and desperation in equal measure, which she seemed to think was a selling point. 2 weeks into their venture, they'd made $37. It seemed both like a fortune and nowhere near enough. At this rate, we'll have the money by winter, Matthew said, discouraged, as they counted their earnings at the kitchen table. Then we increased the rate, Eleanor replied, her voice determined despite her exhaustion. She'd been up since 4, preparing for tomorrow's preserving. The church social is this weekend. If we can sell directly to people there. I don't go to church socials. You do now. Matthew looked at her, this woman who'd arrived with nothing and was now ordering him around his own kitchen, and surprised them both by almost smiling. Yes, ma'am. The church social was held on the grounds of Dustmere's only church, a white clapboard building that looked like it had been dropped from heaven and landed slightly crooked. The entire town turned out, partly for worship, but mostly for gossip and food. Eleanor had insisted they all dress in their best. Matthew in a shirt she'd pressed until it could stand on its own, Lily in a dress Eleanor had let out to accommodate her growth, and Eleanor herself in the blue dress that had started all this, now cleaned and mended until it looked almost respectable. They set up their table under Mrs. Henley's enthusiastic direction, jars of preserves catching the sunlight like jeweled offerings. Lily had made a sign, Callahan Ranch Goods, made with care. At first, people just looked, some with curiosity, others with the kind of pity Eleanor had learned to recognize and ignore. But then Reverend Morrison's wife bought a jar of strawberry jam, declaring loudly that it was the best she'd ever tasted. That broke the dam. Soon there was a crowd, and Eleanor was making change as fast as her fingers could move. Is it true you're the bride from the station? One woman asked, not unkindly but with obvious curiosity. I was, Eleanor said simply. Now I'm the woman who makes the best apple butter in the territory. Bold claim, the woman said, but she bought 2 jars. Matthew stood slightly apart, uncomfortable with the social aspect, but protective of their small enterprise. When Marcus Reed appeared, moving through the crowd like oil through water, Matthew stepped closer to the table. "Quite the little business," Reed said, picking up a jar and examining it like he was looking for flaws. "Though I wonder if you've paid the proper licensing fees for commercial sales." "We're selling farm goods at a church social," Eleanor said before Matthew could respond. "Last I checked, that didn't require territorial approval." "Everything requires approval, Miss Bennett. Or is it Mrs. Callahan now? Hard to keep track of these informal arrangements." The crowd around their table had gone quiet, that particular prairie silence that preceded either storms or violence. Eleanor felt Matthew tense beside her, saw his hands curl into fists. "The arrangement," Matthew said, his voice carrying despite its quiet tone, "is that Miss Bennett is employed at the ranch. The fact that she's generous enough to help with additional ventures to pay taxes that weren't due for months yet is testament to her character. Though I doubt you'd recognize character if it bit you." Reed's face flushed red. "2 weeks, Callahan. Have my money or lose the ranch." "We'll have it," Lily piped up, startling everyone. "Every penny, you overgrown tax leech." The silence that followed was deafening. Then old Pete started laughing, a rusty sound like a gate that hadn't been opened in years. Others joined in, and suddenly Reed was surrounded by laughter. Not cruel, but dismissive, which was somehow worse. He left without another word, and the crowd returned to buying preserves with renewed enthusiasm, as if purchasing jam was an act of rebellion against territorial overreach. By the end of the social, they'd made $42. Combined with what they'd already earned and Lily's contribution, they had $94. Still not enough, but closer. That night, as they counted money at the kitchen table, Lily asleep with her head on her arms, Matthew looked at Eleanor with something approaching wonder. "You did this," he said. "We did this." "No," he shook his head. "I'd have given up, sold what I could, probably lost the ranch eventually anyway. You saw a different way. I saw what was already here, just waiting to be used." She gestured around the kitchen, at the empty jars waiting to be filled, the cloth covers Lily had cut, the evidence of their shared labor. "This was all Hannah's foundation. I just built on it." Matthew's jaw tightened at his wife's name, but not with the old pain. This was something else, something that looked like acceptance. "She would have liked you," he said quietly. "Hannah, she would have liked your spine." "My spine?" "The way you stand up to things. The worky, even me." He paused, seeming to wrestle with words. "Especially me." Before Eleanor could respond, Lily stirred, mumbling something about needing more labels. Matthew scooped her up with the easy strength of long practice. "I'll put her to bed," he said, but paused at the doorway. "Eleanor." "Yes?" "Thank you for seeing what could be instead of what was." It was the second time he'd used her given name, and this time there was no emergency to explain it away. Just a choice, a small step across a boundary that had been shrinking for days. That night, long after both Lily and Matthew had gone to sleep, Eleanor sat alone in the kitchen, reviewing their progress. They still needed more than $100, and there were just 12 days left. It seemed impossible, yet giving up was unthinkable. She was so absorbed in her calculations that she didn't hear Matthew return from the barn. His voice made her jump. "You should be sleeping." She looked up to find him standing in the doorway, his face half in shadow. "So should you." He moved into the room, pulling out the chair across from her. "I've been thinking. A dangerous pastime." That ghost of a smile appeared again. "About what happens if we can't raise the money." Eleanor set down her pencil. "We will. But if we don't," he took a breath, "I want you to take Lily to Boston." "What?" "If we lose the ranch, I want you to take her east, give her the education, the opportunities Hannah would have wanted for her. And you, where would you be in this plan?" Matthew looked down at his hands, scarred from labor but capable of such gentleness, with Lily. "I'd find work, send money when I could." "That's ridiculous." His head snapped up. "Excuse me? You're talking about splitting up your family, about giving up before we've even exhausted all possibilities. I'm talking about doing what's best for my daughter. And what's best for Lily is having her father, having a home, even if it's not this one." Eleanor leaned forward, suddenly fierce. "We are not discussing contingency plans for failure. We are finding a way to succeed." Matthew stared at her, surprise warring with something else in his expression, something that might have been respect, or might have been more. You're something else, Eleanor Bennett. And don't you forget it, Matthew Callahan. They held each other's gaze across the table, the air between them charged with an energy neither was quite ready to name. Finally, Matthew nodded, once, decisive. All right, no contingency plans, just success. Just success, she agreed. When he went back to the barn, Eleanor remained at the table, her heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with financial concerns. Something had shifted between them tonight, something fundamental. They were no longer employer and employee, no longer reluctant housemates thrown together by circumstance. They were partners now, united in purpose, if not in name. The realization should have frightened her, but instead, it felt like finding solid ground after months of drifting. Like coming home, though home had never before looked like a Wyoming ranch with leaky chinking and a temperamental stove. Eleanor went to bed that night in Hannah's room, under Hannah's quilt, but for the first time, she didn't feel like an intruder. She felt like someone who was exactly where she was meant to be, even if the journey there had taken an unexpected route. Outside, the Wyoming night spread its star-spangled canvas across the skipame. Inside, a woman who'd thought herself lost found herself making plans for a future she'd never imagined, but now couldn't bear to lose. The next week brought a development no one had anticipated. A letter arrived for Eleanor, forwarded from the station, thick with the kind of paper that suggested money and importance. The return address was Boston, from a law firm she didn't recognize. Eleanor stared at the envelope, her name written in precise legal script. She hadn't contacted anyone in Boston since arriving in Wyoming. No one should know where to find her. Bad news? Matthew asked, pausing in the doorway. He'd been fixing a harness, his hands darkened with leather oil. I don't know yet. Eleanor broke the seal with trembling fingers, aware of Matthew watching from across the room. As she unfolded the letter, her eyes widened. It's from my great-aunt's estate, Aunt Millicent. I barely knew her. Matthew set down the harness, moving closer. Anne? Eleanor looked up, her expression a mixture of disbelief and something like cosmic irony. She's died and left me $200. 200. Matthew repeated the number with quiet reverence. The exact amount we need. The coincidence felt like either divine intervention or cosmic mockery. Eleanor read through the letter again, searching for conditions or complications. But there were none. The money was hers, freely given by a distant relative she'd met perhaps twice in her life. That's wonderful, Matthew said carefully, his tone suggesting it was anything but wonderful to him. You can go back east now. Start over properly. Eleanor looked up from the letter to find him turned away, his shoulders rigid with tension. Is that what you think I want? To leave? It's what you should want. He gestured around the kitchen at the preserving supplies, the evidence of their hard work. This isn't a life, it's just survival. And what's wrong with survival if you're surviving with people who matter? Lily appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of raised voices. Are you leaving? She asked Eleanor, her voice small and scared. No, Eleanor said firmly, then looked at Matthew. Unless I'm being asked to. The silence stretched between them, sweet and difficult to navigate. Finally, Matthew turned around, his eyes holding something that might have been fear, or might have been hope, or might have been both tangled together like fishing line. I'm not asking you to leave, he said. I'm saying you should. There's a difference. The difference being one's about what makes sense and the other's about what I want. And what do you want? Lily looked between them like she was watching a tennis match played with words instead of balls. Matthew seemed to crumble and solidify at the same time, like a wall that falls only to reveal stronger stone beneath. I want you to stay, he admitted, his voice low. God help me, I want you to stay. But not because you've got nowhere else to go. Not because we need your money or your help or your preserves. Then why? Eleanor pressed, stepping closer. Because this place makes sense when you're here, he said in a rush. Because Lily smiles again. Because I don't feel like I'm drowning every minute of every day. Because you see this life as something more than just endurance. And when you're here, I start to see it that way too. Eleanor felt her heart doing something complicated in her chest, like it was trying to remember a dance it had never quite learned. I have a proposal, she said, her voice steadier than her hands. A business proposal. Matthew's expression shuddered slightly. Business. We use the money to pay Reed, all of it. That saves the ranch. Eleanor straightened her spine, meeting his eyes directly. In exchange, I become a full partner. Not an employee, not a guest. A partner in the ranch and the preserves business. And, she paused, searching his face, in whatever this is becoming. Partners, Matthew repeated, testing the word. Equal partners. My name on the deed alongside yours. That's not how things are done. Nothing about how I arrived here was how things are done, Eleanor countered, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Why start being conventional now? Lily, who'd been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly burst out, Say yes, Daddy. Say yes before she changes her mind, and we lose everything. Matthew looked at his daughter, then back at Eleanor, who stood there in her flour-dusted apron with her hair coming undone and her chin raised like she was ready to fight the world. His wife had been nothing like this woman. Hannah had been gentle, soft-spoken, a spring rain to Eleanor's summer storm. But maybe that's what they needed now. Someone who could stand up to the drought that grief had brought. Partners, he agreed, extending his hand. Eleanor shook it, her hand small but firm in his. And if they held on a moment longer than business required, only Lily noticed, and she was too busy dancing around the kitchen to comment. They paid Reed the next day, Eleanor insisting on going along to witness the transaction. The tax assessor's face when he realized the desperate ranch had raised his blood money was almost worth the months of worry. He counted the bills 3 times, looking for some reason to refuse them. This doesn't mean you're safe, he said finally. Taxes come due every year. And we'll pay them every year, Eleanor replied with a glance at Matthew, with preserved money if necessary. The territorial government doesn't run on jam, Miss Bennett. No, but it apparently runs on squeezing families until they break. I'd say jam is the more honorable currency. Reed left without another word, but his expression promised this wasn't over. On the ride back to the ranch, Matthew was quiet. Finally, as they reached the gate, he said, You didn't have to give all of it, the inheritance. You could have kept some back, had security. I have security, Eleanor said, turning in her saddle to face him. I have a partnership in a ranch, a thriving preserves business, and a family that needs me. What more security could I want? A family, Matthew repeated softly. Aren't we? She challenged gently. We fight like family, work like family, protect each other like family. Just because we came together unconventionally doesn't make it less real. No, he agreed, something warm lighting in his eyes. It doesn't. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching Lily chase fireflies, Matthew pulled something from his pocket. It was a ring, but not a gold one. This was carved from wood, smooth and simple. I made this, he said, not quite meeting her eyes. It's not much, but I thought, if we're partners, there should be something to mark it. Eleanor took the ring, feeling the careful workmanship, the hours that must have gone into making something so smooth from something so rough. It's perfect, she said and meant it. She slipped it onto her right hand, not her wedding finger, not yet, but a finger that meant business and partnership and possibility. Matthew watched her and something in his expression eased, like a knot that had been tied too long, finally loosening. Miss Eleanor, Lily called, running over with a jar full of fireflies. Look, I caught falling stars. Those are fireflies, sweetheart. I know, but if you squint, they look like stars that got tired of being so high up and came down to dance. She thrust the jar at Eleanor. Make a wish. Eleanor looked at the swirling lights, then at Lily's eager face, then at Matthew, who was watching them both with an expression she couldn't quite read, but that made her chest feel too small for her heart. I don't need to, she said. It already came true. What did? Lily asked, wide-eyed. Finding where I belong. Lily considered this seriously. Was that what you wished for on the train platform when you were waiting? Eleanor thought about those 3 days sitting on that bench, watching her dreams dissolve like sugar in rain. No, she said honestly. I wished for something completely different, but sometimes the best gifts are the ones you didn't know to ask for. Matthew stood, his hand finding Eleanor's shoulder, a brief touch, but waited with meaning. It's getting late. Lily needs to wash up for bed. I'm not tired, Lily protested, even as she yawned. Fireflies are, Eleanor said. We should let them go so they can sleep. They released the fireflies together, watching them disperse into the darkness, little points of light spreading across the prairie, like hope made visible. And for the first time since arriving in Wyoming, Eleanor didn't think about the train that might take her away. She thought about the dawn that would bring another day here, in this place that was becoming home, one preserved jar, one shared meal, one wooden ring at a time. The summer heat had settled over Wyoming like a wool blanket, heavy and inescapable. 3 months had passed since Eleanor had paid off Reed, and the ranch had found its rhythm, a careful dance of survival in something that might have been contentment. But contentment, Eleanor had learned, was as fragile as morning frost in July. She discovered the letters by accident, looking for Hannah's recipe box that Lily swore contained the secret to perfect pie crust. The box was in the cellar, tucked behind preserving jars. But when Eleanor pulled it free, a bundle of papers fell with it. Letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, addressed in Matthew's careful hand to my dearest Hannah. She shouldn't have read them. She knew that even as her fingers untied the ribbon, even as her eyes found the first words. But grief makes archaeologists of us all, searching for clues about how others survived what seems unsurvivable. I write to you at night, the first letter began, dated just weeks after Hannah's death. The house is so quiet I can hear my own heartbeat, and it sounds wrong, like a clock ticking in an empty room. Lily asked today why you won't wake up. I told her you were sleeping with the angels. She said angels should learn to share. I had no answer for that. Eleanor sat on the cellar floor, surrounded by jars of preserves she'd made, reading a dead woman's love letters from the husband who still mourned her. Each letter was a conversation with silence, updates about Lily, about the ranch, about the thousand small ways life continued despite everything. Lily learned to braid her own hair today, one read. It's crooked and loose, but she was so proud. I didn't have the heart to fix it. You would have known how to make it right without making her feel wrong. I never learned that balance. The last letter was dated just a week before Eleanor arrived. I'm forgetting your voice, Matthew had written. Yesterday I tried to remember how you laughed and I couldn't. It's like you're dying again, piece by piece, memory by memory. I'm so angry at you for leaving, and even angrier at myself for being angry. Lily needs more than this ghost I've become. I pray for strength, but all I get is another sunrise I didn't ask for. You weren't supposed to find those. Eleanor looked up to find Matthew on the cellar stairs, his expression unreadable in the dim light. I was looking for the recipe box, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I shouldn't have. They're private. I know. She began gathering the letters, fumbling to retie the ribbon. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have read them. Read them aloud. She blinked. What? He came down the stairs, each step deliberate. I write them, but I never read them back. Maybe hearing them in someone else's voice will make them real. Make her real again, just for a moment. So Eleanor read, her voice steady, even as her heart broke for this man who loved so deeply he had to write letters to nowhere. Matthew sat on an overturned bucket, his head in his hands, shoulders shaking silently as she gave voice to his grief. When she finished, the cellar was quiet except for their breathing. She wouldn't have liked you, Matthew said suddenly. The words stung more than Eleanor expected. Oh, not at first. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. Hannah was jealous as a cat when it came to other women, would have seen you as a threat. Eleanor began refolding the letters, not meeting his gaze. I'm not trying to. I know that, Matthew interrupted, and after a while she would have loved you, would have recognized what I'm only just starting to see, which is that you're not here to replace her. You're here to continue what she started. Different melody, same song. Before Eleanor could respond, Lily's voice rang out from above. Daddy, Miss Eleanor, Ryder coming. They climbed from the cellar to find not Reed, but something potentially worse. A gentleman on an expensive horse, looking exactly as his letters had described. James Miller, the real James Miller, very much alive and sitting tall in the saddle, his confident smile now edged with something sharp. Miss Bennett, he said, tipping his hat. Imagine my surprise when I heard my intended bride had taken up residence at the Callahan Ranch. Your intended bride never existed, Eleanor said, finding her voice. You wrote to 6 women, Mr. Miller. I compared letters with 2 others at the station. Same promises, same lies, different names. His smile didn't waver. Business correspondence sometimes requires flexibility, but I'm here now, ready to honor our agreement. What agreement? Matthew stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Eleanor. The marriage agreement, of course. Miller's gaze traveled over Eleanor with the calculating assessment of a man inspecting livestock. Miss Bennett traveled here to marry me. I was delayed by business, but I'm prepared to fulfill my obligations now. His eyes traveled over the ranch with the assessment of a man counting assets. Though it seems she's done quite well for herself in my absence. She's not going anywhere with you, Matthew said, his voice low and dangerous. That's not your decision, Mr. Callahan. Miller dismounted, his movements polished and deliberate. Miss Bennett and I have a contract. A contract based on lies, Eleanor said, stepping forward to stand beside Matthew. You don't even have a ranch. I do now. Won it in a card game last month. Miller's smile widened. The Baxter place, 40 acres of good land, perfect for a married couple starting fresh. Lily, who'd been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly spoke up. Miss Eleanor can't marry you. She's marrying Daddy. The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor felt her face flush. Matthew went rigid beside her, and Miller's smile widened like a snake unhinging its jaw. Is that so? Miller asked. Because from what I hear in town, Miss Bennett is merely employed here unless there's something more informal happening. The insinuation was clear and ugly, the kind of rumor that could destroy a woman's reputation faster than wildfire consumed prairie grass. Nothing improper has occurred, Matthew said, each word precise as a hammer blow. Of course not. Miller adjusted his gloves with theatrical care. But people talk, especially when a young woman lives with a widower, unchaperoned, except for a child. I'm offering Miss Bennett respectability, a real marriage, not whatever arrangement you've cobbled together here. You're offering her lies, Matthew countered, same as your letters. Perhaps, but lies with a wedding ring carry more weight than truth without one. Eleanor felt something snap inside her, that same clarity that had made her follow Lily home all those months ago. Mr. Miller, she said, stepping around Matthew despite his attempt to keep her behind him, I wouldn't marry you if you were the last man in Wyoming territory. You're a confidence man, a schemer, and probably a dozen other things that wouldn't bear a close examination. Careful, Miss Bennett, Miller warned, his smile finally slipping. Defamation is a serious charge. Truth isn't defamation. And the truth is, I'd rather be considered a fallen woman living in sin with Matthew Callahan than a respectable wife to someone like you. Her words rang across the yard like a bell. Matthew turned to stare at her, and she could feel Lily practically vibrating with excitement beside them. Miller's face darkened. You'll regret this, both of you. He remounted his horse with practiced efficiency. I don't take rejection, well. Then you should stop proposing to women under false pretenses, Eleanor shot back. He wheeled his horse around but paused before riding off. This isn't over. I came here for a bride, and I don't leave empty-handed. After he was gone, the 3 of them stood in the yard like actors who'd forgotten their next lines. Did you mean it? Matthew asked quietly. Which part? The part about... He hesitated, glancing at Lily, who was pretending not to listen. About preferring to be fallen with me than respectable with him. Every word. He looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression like ice beginning its spring thaw. Lily, go inside. But Daddy, inside now. The child went, but not before giving Eleanor a thumbs up that was anything but subtle. When they were alone, Matthew took Eleanor's hands. His were shaking slightly, and she realized hers were too. I'm not good at this, he said, at words, at feelings, at anything that isn't work and worry. Hannah knew how to read my silences, but I can't ask that of you. Then don't be silent. He took a breath that seemed to come from his boots. I love you. The words hung between them, simple and complicated as breathing. Not the way I loved Hannah, he continued quickly. That was spring rain, necessary and gentle. This is different. This is like wildfire, Terrifying and consuming and absolutely beyond my control. His hands tightened around hers. I've been fighting it because it feels like betrayal. But maybe the real betrayal would be letting you leave with him, or letting you leave at all. Matthew, I know we agreed to partnership, business, nothing romantic. I know you came here by accident. I know you deserve better than a broken-down rancher with too much grief and not enough grace. But if you meant what you said about choosing this over respectability, Eleanor kissed him. It was easier than finding words for the feeling that had been building since the first morning he'd let her fix his burnt eggs. His lips were chapped from sun and wind, and he tasted like coffee and dust and home. When they pulled apart, both breathing hard, Matthew looked stunned. Was that a yes? He asked. That was a stop talking and kiss me again. He did, pulling her closer, and for a moment the heat wasn't oppressive but necessary, burning away the last of their careful distance. Daddy, Miss Eleanor, are you done yet? Lily called from the window. Because Mr. Henley's coming, and you should probably stop doing whatever you're doing. They jumped apart like guilty teenagers, and despite everything, Eleanor laughed. Matthew's mouth quirked in what was almost a smile, and he kept one hand on her waist as Henley's wagon approached. But Henley wasn't alone. Half the town seemed to be with him, Mrs. Holloway, the Pattersons, even Reverend Morrison. They pulled into the yard like a convoy of concern. We heard Miller was here, Mrs. Holloway said without preamble. That confidence man who's been promising marriage to half the desperate women in 3 territories. He was, Matthew confirmed. He's gone. Not far, old Pete said, spitting tobacco juice. He's at the saloon telling anyone who'll listen that Matthew Callahan stole his bride, making implications about Miss Bennet's virtue that don't bear repeating. Eleanor felt Matthew tense beside her, his hand moving reflexively toward where his gun would be if he were wearing it. Don't, she said quietly. That's what he wants. Violence would prove his point. Then what do you suggest? Matthew's voice was tight with controlled fury. Reverend Morrison cleared his throat. Perhaps a more civilized solution. A public declaration of your intentions might silence the gossips. What intentions? Matthew asked, though his hand tightened on Eleanor's waist. Marriage intentions, Mrs. Henley said bluntly. It's been clear as day to anyone with eyes that you two have been dancing around each other for months. Make it official, and Miller's got no ground to stand on. We can't marry to spite James Miller, Eleanor protested, though her heart raced at the suggestion. No, Reverend Morrison agreed, but you could marry because you love each other and let spiting Miller be a pleasant side effect. Lily, who'd snuck outside despite orders, tugged on Matthew's shirt. Daddy, you love Miss Eleanor, right? Matthew looked down at his daughter, then at Eleanor, then at the assembled neighbors who'd come to defend their reputation. Yes, he said simply, I do. And Miss Eleanor, you love my daddy. Eleanor thought about the letters in the cellar, about Hannah, who'd loved this man enough to build a life with him in the middle of nowhere, about James Miller and his false promises, about 3 days on a train platform waiting for something that didn't exist, about finding something real in the last place she'd expected. Yes, she said, I do. Then what are we waiting for? Lily demanded. What indeed, Eleanor thought. Convention, proper mourning periods, the approval of strangers. None of that had brought her here. A child in oversized boots had brought her here. And maybe that was exactly the kind of logic this situation required. Matthew, she began, turning to face him fully, we should talk about this privately. No, his voice was firm. No more private, no more careful. If I'm going to do this, I'm doing it right. To her astonishment, he dropped to one knee right there in the dusty yard, in front of God and half of Dustmere. Eleanor Bennett, you came here for the wrong man, but found the right life. Would you do me the honor of making it official? Mrs. Holloway gasped. Lily squealed. Old Pete muttered something about it being about damn time. I don't have a ring, Matthew continued, then remembered. Wait, yes I do. He pulled the wooden band from her right hand. This was meant as a symbol of partnership. Now I'd like it to be a promise. Marry me, Eleanor. Not because of Miller, not because of gossip, but because you make this broken place whole again. Eleanor looked at this man on his knee in the dust, offering her a ring that meant family and future and forever. She thought about Hannah's letters, about the love that had built this ranch. She wasn't replacing that love. She was adding to it, like a quilt made from pieces of different lives stitched into something new. Yes, she said, and the yard erupted. Lily launched herself at them both, nearly knocking Matthew over. The neighbors cheered. Mrs. Holloway was actually crying, though she'd deny it later. When? Reverend Morrison asked, practical even in celebration. Now, Matthew said, standing and brushing dust from his knees. Today, before Miller can cause more trouble. Matthew, I'm wearing my work dress, Eleanor protested. You're perfect, he said, and the way he looked at her made her believe it. They were married an hour later in the church with half the town as witnesses. Lily stood between them, holding their hands like she was the one joining them together, which in a way, she was. James Miller heard about the wedding before they'd even finished saying their vows. He left town that night, but not before setting one last cruel plan in motion. The fire started in the barn just after midnight. Eleanor woke to the smell of smoke and Matthew's shout of alarm. They ran outside to find the structure fully engulfed, flames reaching toward the star-filled sky like desperate fingers. The horses! Lily screamed. Matthew was already running toward the inferno. Without thinking, Eleanor followed. The heat was like a living thing, pushing against them with violent intent. Inside, the horses were screaming, panicked, dangerous. Take this one. Matthew shoved a rope into her hands. Lead her out. Don't stop. Don't look back. Eleanor grabbed the rope, pulling a terrified mare toward the door. The horse fought, reared, nearly struck her, but she held on with desperate strength. Behind her, she could hear Matthew fighting to free the other animals. The crack of burning wood, the roar of consuming fire. She got the mare out, handed her off to a neighbor who'd come running when they saw the flames, and went back in despite Matthew's shouted orders to stay outside. She found him struggling with the last horse, Hannah's gelding, the one he couldn't bear to sell even when they needed the money most. Get out, he yelled when he saw her. Instead, she grabbed a bucket of water someone had filled and doused him with it, then helped him pull the stubborn gelding free. They burst from the barn just as the roof began to collapse, diving away from the shower of sparks and burning debris. They lay in the dirt, gasping, coughing, still holding the horse's rope. The barn continued to burn, but all the animals were safe. You could have died, Matthew said, his voice raw from smoke. So could you. She touched his face, smudged with soot. I had to save them, and I had to save you. He pulled her against him, not caring that they were covered in dirt and sweat and singed cloth. We're a mess, he said. We're alive, she countered. We're married, Lily added, having appeared beside them with a bucket of water and her typical timing, for exactly 6 hours now. Matthew laughed, actually laughed, the sound rusty but real. Hell of a wedding night. Language, Daddy. Sorry, Lily Bird. They fought the fire until dawn, the entire community appearing as if summoned by smoke signals. They saved the house, the other outbuildings, but the barn was gone. As the sun rose, illuminating the smoldering ruins, Eleanor saw something glinting in the ashes. It was a pocket watch, one she recognized from James Miller's vest. He'd been careless, left evidence of his arson. We could have him arrested, Matthew said when she showed him. We could, Eleanor agreed, turning the watch over in her soot-stained hands. Or we could let him run, knowing that we survived his worst and came out stronger. That's very forgiving of you. Not forgiving, practical. Miller's the kind of man who creates his own punishment. We don't need to help. They stood together, looking at the destroyed barn. It would take months to rebuild. Money they didn't have, labor they could barely spare. But neighbors were already talking about a barn raising, and old Pete was calculating lumber needs, and Mrs. Holloway was organizing food committees. We'll rebuild, Matthew said, his arm around Eleanor's waist. Better than before. Different than before, she corrected. But yes, better. He kissed her temple, gentle despite everything. I'm sorry this isn't the life you expected when you answered that advertisement. Eleanor thought about those foolish dreams of romance and adventure, of a handsome stranger who would sweep her into a fairy tale. Instead, she'd found a grieving widower, a precocious child in a ranch that demanded everything and promised nothing except more work tomorrow. No, she said, leaning into his strength. It's infinitely better. The barn raising happened 2 weeks later. The entire county showed up, even people they'd never met, drawn by the story of the bride from the station who'd married the grieving rancher and fought fire on her wedding night. By sunset, a new barn stood where the old one had burned, built by community and consecrated by hope. That night, as they stood on the porch watching Lily chase fireflies with the Henley children, Matthew pulled out another letter. "What's that?" Eleanor asked. "Something I wrote this morning." He handed it to her, looking almost shy, this man who'd fought fire and grief and territorial officials without flinching. "My dearest Eleanor," she read aloud, "today I watched you teaching Lily to make preserves, and she laughed when jam splattered your nose. It was Hannah's laugh, but Lily's joy, and for the first time, the echo didn't hurt. You've taught us that moving forward doesn't mean forgetting, that new love doesn't diminish old love, that a heart can be broken and whole at the same time. I don't write to Hannah anymore. I talk to her sometimes when I'm alone, but I don't need letters to nowhere when I have love right here. Thank you for waiting on that platform. Thank you for following Lily home. Thank you for choosing us when you could have chosen anywhere else. Your devoted husband," I'm still getting used to writing that, "Matthew." Eleanor was crying by the time she finished reading, but they were the kind of tears that watered good things. "You found your words," she said. "You gave them back to me." Lily ran up then, jar of fireflies in hand. "Look, I caught enough to light the whole house." "Those are for outside, little bird," Matthew said. But he was smiling, a real smile now, not the ghost of one. "Everything good's for outside anyway," Lily declared. "That's why we live in Wyoming." It was child's logic, but it made its own sense. They were outside people now, Eleanor realized. People who faced storms head-on, who rebuilt what burned, who found love in the most unexpected places. "Tell me the story," Lily demanded, settling between them on the porch step. "What story?" "The one about how you came to us, about waiting and finding and choosing." So Eleanor told it, with Matthew adding details she'd forgotten or never knew. How desperate he'd been that morning Lily disappeared. How he'd almost gone to the station himself but couldn't face the possibility of Lily not being there. How he'd known the moment he saw Eleanor teaching Lily to braid hair that their lives had changed forever. "But you didn't say anything," Eleanor protested. "I was scared," he admitted, his arm warm around her shoulders. "Scared of hoping again, scared of losing again. Just scared." "Not anymore?" "Still scared," he said, taking her hand, the wooden ring gleaming in the firefly light. "But brave enough to be scared and choose love anyway." The fireflies rose around them like tiny celebrations, and Lily released her captured ones to join the dance. They sat on the porch of their fire-tested, community-built, love-sustained home, watching light triumph over darkness in the smallest, most persistent ways. "We should go to bed," Matthew said eventually. "Dawn comes early." "Dawn always comes," Eleanor agreed, standing and pulling him up with her. "That's the promise." They went inside, Lily chattering about tomorrow's plans, Matthew's hand warm on Eleanor's back, the wooden ring on her finger catching the last of the light. Behind them, the new barn stood solid against the darkening sky, built on ashes but reaching towards stars. The first snow came early that year, October barely gone when white began dusting the mountains like flour on a baker's table. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her stomach, watching Matthew and Lily work to bring the cattle closer to home. 6 months married, and she still sometimes forgot this life was truly hers, that the name Callahan belonged to her now too. The discovery of her pregnancy had been typically understated. She'd fainted while making preserves. Matthew had caught her before she hit the floor, and Doc Patterson had been summoned with all the panic of a man who'd already lost one wife. But the doctor's prognosis had been cheerful. "Healthy as a horse," he'd declared, "and probably twice as stubborn, knowing you, Mrs. Callahan." Lily had taken the news with the solemnity of a child given great responsibility. "I'm going to be the best big sister," she'd announced. "I'll teach the baby everything. How to milk cows, how to spot good preserving berries, how to know when Daddy's pretending he's not hurt so he doesn't worry us." That last observation had made Matthew flush and mutter something about children seeing too much. but he'd been gentler since then, watchful in a way that might have been irritating if it wasn't so clearly born of fear. Now, watching them work together in the pre-winter light, Eleanor allowed herself a moment of perfect contentment. The ranch was prospering. Their preserves business had expanded, the cattle were healthy, and the new barn had weathered its first summer beautifully. Reed had been removed from office, caught in a scheme involving land records and railroad interests. Miller had never returned, though occasional stories drifted back of a smooth-talking man working similar schemes in Colorado territory. As Eleanor watched, a carriage appeared on the horizon, moving with purpose toward the ranch. For a moment, old fears surfaced. Reed returning, Miller with new threats. But then she recognized the carriage from the station, and her anxiety shifted to curiosity. Matthew and Lily had seen it too. They finished their task quickly, and Matthew strode toward the house, his face a mask of caution. "Are you expecting anyone?" he asked as he entered. Eleanor shook her head. "Perhaps it's just passing through, looking for directions." "Stay inside," Matthew said, his hand moving to the rifle by the door, "just to be safe." But when the carriage drew closer, it was Eleanor who gasped. "It can't be." A woman stepped down from the carriage, elegant despite the journey's dust, her gray hair neatly pinned beneath a fashionable hat. She stood for a moment, surveying the ranch with an expression that mixed trepidation and determination. "Who is that?" Matthew asked, watching the stranger approach. "Margaret Callahan," Eleanor whispered, "Hannah's mother." Matthew went still beside her, his body rigid with shock. "How do you—" "The photograph in the trunk. I only saw her once, but it's her. I'm certain." Lily had joined them on the porch, curious about the visitor. Now she looked up at her father, confused by his frozen posture. "Daddy?" "Stay with Eleanor," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "I'll handle this." He stepped off the porch to meet the woman, his movements measured and deliberate. Eleanor couldn't hear their exchange, but she could see the tension in Matthew's shoulders, the careful way he held himself, like a man bracing for a blow. Margaret Callahan was speaking, her gloved hands moving in small, agitated gestures. When she finished, Matthew was silent for a long moment. Then, to Eleanor's surprise, he nodded and gestured toward the house. They approached the porch together, Matthew's expression unreadable. "Eleanor," he said, his voice oddly formal, "this is Margaret Callahan, Hannah's mother. Mrs. Callahan, my wife, Eleanor." Margaret's eyes moved from Eleanor's face to her swollen middle, then to Lily, who was half hidden behind Eleanor's skirts. For a moment, her composure cracked, and Eleanor saw raw grief in the older woman's eyes. "She has Hannah's eyes," Margaret said softly. "Exactly Hannah's eyes." "Grandmother?" Lily whispered, the word strange and new on her tongue. That single word seemed to break something in Margaret. She sank to her knees despite the dust, reaching trembling hands toward Lily. "Oh, my dear girl, you look just like her." The reunion was awkward, weighted with years of absence. Margaret had disapproved of Hannah marrying a rancher, had cut contact when Hannah refused to return to Boston. She'd learned of Hannah's death months after the fact, too late for the funeral, too proud to come groveling for forgiveness. "But I've been following your struggles," she said over coffee that Eleanor had somehow managed to make despite the shock. The newspaper in Cheyenne carried the story about the bride from the station who saved a failing ranch. When I realized it was Matthew's ranch, Hannah's home, I knew I had to come. "Why now?" Matthew's voice was carefully neutral, but Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders. "Because I'm old and tired of being proud and alone," Margaret said simply. "Because I have money that could help and no one else to leave it to. Because I want to know my granddaughter before it's too late." She produced a bank draft that made Eleanor gasp. "This is far too much." "It's what Hannah would have inherited," Margaret said, her eyes filling with tears. "What she gave up to follow her heart." She looked around the room, taking in the preserves lining the shelves, the checkerboard where Lily and Eleanor played, the leather-bound journal where Matthew now recorded ranch business instead of grief. "I was so angry that she chose love over comfort, but looking at this place, at what you've built and rebuilt and fought for, I understand now. This is what love looks like. Not grand gestures, but daily choices to stay, to work, to hope." Lily, who'd been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke. "Mama talked about you, said you smelled like roses, and read her stories about princesses. Margaret broke down completely then, and it was Lily who went to her, small arms offering comfort to the grandmother she'd never thought to meet. "You can stay," Lily said firmly. "We have room. Miss Eleanor, I mean Mama Eleanor, made the spare room nice again." The word mama hung in the air. Lily had been trying it out for weeks, never quite settling on what to call the woman who'd married her father. "Is that okay?" she asked Eleanor. "Mama Eleanor, since I'll need to teach the baby the difference between you and Mama who died." "It's perfect," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. Margaret stayed for a week that became a month that became a permanent arrangement. She took over the household accounts, freeing Eleanor to focus on her expanding preserves business and her expanding belly. She taught Lily the things Hannah hadn't lived long enough to teach: embroidery, poetry, the proper way to set a table for company. "Not that we have much company," Lily pointed out. "That will change," Margaret predicted, with the confidence of a woman who'd arranged Boston society events for 40 years. She was right. As November deepened into December, the Callahan Ranch became a gathering place. The success against Reed had made them symbols of resistance against corruption. People came for advice, for hope, for Eleanor's preserves, and Margaret's Boston wisdom, and Matthew's quiet strength. On Christmas Eve, with snow falling soft as flour, and the house warm with fire and fellowship, Matthew stood to make a toast. The parlor was full: neighbors, friends, the family they'd chosen and the family they'd found. "A year ago," he said, "this house was silent. Lily and I went through the motions of living without really being alive. Then a woman got off a train with nowhere to go and everything to give." He looked at Eleanor, his eyes soft with love. "She didn't save us. We saved each other. We saved ourselves. But mostly we learned that family isn't just about blood or promises or even love. It's about choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. It's about fighting for each other when fighting alone would be safer. It's about building something from ashes and believing it will stand." He raised his glass to Eleanor, who was radiant despite being enormously pregnant. "To my wife who waited for the wrong man and found the right life." "To Matthew," Eleanor countered, "who had the courage to love again when loss seemed safer." "To Lily," Margaret added, tears streaming down her face, "who brought us all together with the wisdom of a child and the heart of a lion." "To the baby," Lily said, not to be outdone, "who's going to be born into the best family in Wyoming, even if we're a little odd." "Especially because we're odd," Matthew corrected, and everyone laughed. Later, after the guests had gone and Margaret had taken Lily up to bed, Matthew and Eleanor sat by the fire, her head on his shoulder, his hand gentle on her belly. "Do you ever think about how different it all could have been?" he asked. "If Miller had been real, if you'd never come here." "Every day," Eleanor admitted, "and every day I'm grateful he was a lie. The truth brought me better things than fiction ever could." The baby kicked, strong and insistent, and Matthew smiled, the full, real smile that had become common in recent months. "Strong like its mother," he said. "Stubborn like its father," she countered. "Lucky," he said, kissing her temple. "Like us all." Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the land in pristine white, hiding the scars of fire in Sturgal under a blanket of new possibility. The ranch slept, peaceful and protected, home to a family stitched together from loss and hope in equal measure. In the spring, there would be a baby. In the summer, the eastern 40 acres to develop. In the fall, another harvest, another chance to build and grow and become. But tonight, in the warmth of Christmas Eve, there was just this: love that had grown from desperation, family that had formed from fragments, and the quiet certainty that some destinations are worth every wrong turn that leads you to them. The clock on the mantel chimed midnight, Christmas arriving with gentle insistence. Matthew stood, pulling Eleanor up with careful attention to her condition. "Where are we going?" she asked. "To see something." He wrapped her in Sarah's old coat, now hers, now part of the continuing story, and led her onto the porch. There in the snow, Lily and Margaret had built a snow family, 5 figures of varying sizes holding hands. "5?" Eleanor asked. "Lily says the baby's definitely a boy," Matthew explained, his arm warm around her waist. "She's usually right about these things." "And the 5th figure?" "That's Hannah," he said simply. Lily says she's still part of our family, just in a different way. Like how spring is still there even in winter, just waiting underneath. Eleanor leaned into him, feeling the baby shift and settle, feeling the weight of all they'd built and fought for and won. She's right, love doesn't leave. It just changes shape. Like water, Matthew agreed. Sometimes ice, sometimes steam, sometimes rain, but always water. They stood there watching snow erase the old year and write the beginning of the new. A family forged not from perfection, but from persistence. Not from plans, but from the beautiful accident of 3 days on a train platform and a little girl brave enough to ask a stranger to come home.